Hi there, kids. This is Pastor Magrey here to thank you for being a part of the Bible Project and for reading the Bible so faithfully and talking about it in your class and with each other. And I'm just so glad to have some moments to tackle some really good questions that you all have asked. I'm always a big fan of good questions. I don't think there's really such a thing as a dumb question or a bad question when it comes to the Bible. And it's really one of my most fun parts of my job to ask good questions myself and to answer good questions, just like the ones that you have brought to me. The first one that you asked is, why did God choose to send angels to talk to people on earth when he could go to talk to them in person or directly? It's true, there are some stories in the Bible where God appears personally to people, like in the book of Genesis when God talks to Adam and Eve. But most of the time, in the Old Testament in particular, people aren't able to experience God face to face. In fact, there are some stories where God's presence is so bright, God's presence is so holy that human beings aren't able to be in the presence of God. And so, time and again, God sends people, messengers, angels, that are essentially in human like form to talk to people in ways that people could understand and relate to God. So, angels are in some ways um, ambassadors that God sends to people to talk to people in ways that they can understand. And I think in some ways that's the way it works today. Whether or not you believe in actual angels, I do think that God still uses lots of different ways to talk to us, including through people that you know, people that love you and care for you. And so I think that that kind of messaging is still important today. Number two, if eating the tree of good and evil was bad for humans, why did God make it in the first place? That's a great question. I think that's a question that's been asked a lot throughout Christian history. One of the things that God created in human beings is the capacity of what we call free will, or the ability to choose whether to love God or not, whether to obey God or not. And you can kind of ask yourself the question, what do you think is better? To be forced to love someone or to choose to love someone? Um, to be forced to obey someone or to choose to obey someone? And of course, I think the better answer is if a person chooses to love you or honor you, or if you choose to love someone or honor someone. And so, what happened in the Garden of Eden is that God created a choice for human beings because God was not interested in making puppets that had no free will or choice, or robots. And so, the whole thing about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and even the presence of the serpent, is all part of God's uh, plan for human beings to choose whether or not to be in a right relationship with God. And I think that's a good thing for us to have as human beings, is the ability to choose. And then the last question or questions here have to do with the serpent itself. How did the snake from Genesis know about what happens when you eat the fruit from the forbidden tree? And if sin entered the world when Adam and Eve disobeyed, why was the snake called crafty, and why did he try and trick him? This seems like a sinful thing to do. So didn't sin already exist with the snake? And wasn't the snake or the devil an angel that rebelled against God? So wasn't that when sin entered? These are all great questions about the origins of the serpent or the tempter or the devil, lots of different names there. What's interesting to me about the serpent is that the serpent definitely did tempt Adam and Eve, but the serpent didn't tempt them with a lie. If you read the Genesis text closely, the tempter actually tempted them with the truth. The serpent came up to him and said, "If you eat of this fruit, you will become like God, and you'll know the difference between good and evil." And later on in verse 22 of Genesis 3, God pretty much says that, yeah, the serpent was telling you the truth, that because you have eaten the fruit, it does in some ways make you like God, able to know the difference between good and evil. So it wasn't that the serpent tempted them with a lie. The serpent tempted them with this idea that they could handle what it would be like to be like God. And the truth of the Genesis story here is that human beings are not able to be equated with God. We don't have the capacity. We're too mistaken prone, we're too limited in our abilities to possibly be like God, or to handle what it would be like to be like God. And so that changes in some ways the relationship between God and human beings. That after Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, it sort of altered the trajectory of human civilization to where now God and humans would be in a different kind of relationship, where now God would be working all the time to help human beings do what it would be necessary to have a right relationship with God again in a way that they could handle it. So where did the serpent come from? Yeah, it's true that I think the book of Isaiah, it talks about the serpent being a fallen angel. Nobody really knows where the serpent came from, except I think it's pretty clear that just like God created that tree of good and evil, God in some ways did allow the presence of that serpent again so that human beings could have a choice, could have free will. The bottom line is, in Genesis, we learn two things. Number one, we have the choice to love God or not, to obey God or not, and it's always best to choose to love and obey God. And number two, we can't handle being like God. God is God and we are not, and God will stop at nothing to help us, to save us from causing harm to ourselves or others. And of course, we believe that the ultimate salvation came in Jesus Christ, who showed us a better way and who helped restore that right relationship that we have with God. All of that is introduced right here in the first few chapters of Genesis, and you can tell already there's some amazing questions that you can ask about these stories. I'm delighted that you're asking them. Thank you and your adult volunteers and your teachers for this great journey that we're on, and I want you to know that I'm available to talk to you, to listen to your questions. I hope this isn't the last time that I do a video like this, because this is a great year ahead and a lot of fun stories to talk about. So thanks very much, kids. Hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye.